Hi guys, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I'm making a card using an older stamp set by W+9 called Color My World, and I'll be doing a watercolor background using Distress Oxide inks. So I'm starting with a piece of Canson watercolor paper cut to 6 by 4 3/4 to give myself room to go ahead and tape that down and still have room to cut off the edges to make it an A2 size card. I'm just using some washi tape here that I actually ran out of, so that last side I'm using Post-it note tape to tape that down. For the center, I'm using a die cut, which you can use any die cut, any shaped item to trace. In this case, it's just a plain rectangle. And I'm using a Cricut pen, which is not only Copic safe, but it is waterproof as well. And I just eyeballed that to be the center, and I just traced that with my pen. For my ink colors, I'm using Candied Apple, Wild Honey, Squeezed Lemonade, Cracked Pistachio, Mermaid Lagoon, and Wilted Violet. And I just have my Ranger craft mat off to the side there, and I just smushed my ink pads down and wet my paper with clear water. I started with the Candied Apple on the top and the Wilted Violet on the bottom, just so that I could get my placement down and know how much room I have for the other 3 colors in between. Once I had the first layer down of the Candied Apple and Wilted Violet, I went ahead and filled that in with Wild Honey, Squeezed Lemonade, and Cracked Pistachio. Once my panel was dry, I went in with a damp paintbrush and some of those areas where that color kind of seeped over into that white panel that we traced, and I just dabbed that up with a paper towel. Most of it will not be noticeable once it's all said and done, but I did want to clean up some of those areas before I continued. Once that was dry, I took my sentiment as well as the masks that I had cut out for the images I planned on using and arranged those on my panel just to kind of see how I was going to want them placed. I ended up only using one of the masks for that tube of paint that's kind of squished. I wanted that to be in the front, so I stamped that first. I'm stamping with Intense Black ink by Simon Says Stamp because I will be doing some Copic coloring. I started with my sentiment on the top, and then I arranged my images on the bottom. For my coloring, I wanted to kind of stick to the same colors as I used in the background. Obviously, they'd be a little bit more intense being I'm using Copics on this instead of the watercolor. I start with my lightest color and lay down where my shadows will be. Then I go on to my darkest and then my two midtones and then back to my lightest. I'm not used to making a card panel this large, so I tried to put the cap so that you could see what colors I was using, but some of them were off screen. This squeezed tube of paint, there's going to be more shadows and less highlights in here just because it is squished in the middle. And I colored those all with reds. And this other one is pretty flat, so I'm leaving a larger highlight on this one. I've never used Copics on watercolor paper. This is the first time. It is different. It just feels like it's not as smooth. I didn't have a problem blending at all. It did bleed a little bit outside of the lines here and there, but it was actually easier to clean up with a colorless blender. It seemed to be able to take away that extra color that you didn't want easier than if you were coloring on Nina. For the edges, I'm using my cool gray markers. I wanted to make it look like a shadow. So I wanted to make this look kind of like a panel that was laying on the card base. Even though it's a flat card, it's a one layer card. So I started with my darkest color, which is the C7, and just used very, very small flicks. Then I went to my C5 and just extended those flicks a little further, and then my C3 and my C1. My C3 was starting to dry out. I could tell that it wasn't blending at all, so I did have to refill that. And I'm only going to show you one side here. I did do all four sides, but it was a bit time consuming, so I'll only show you the one side before we go on to coloring the sentiment. For the word color and the sentiment, again, I wanted to kind of stick to those colors that were in the background. There was 6 colors in the background and there's only 5 letters in color. So I ended up using a combination of Y and YR markers for the O to kind of combine the yellow and the orange. And I'm only using a 3 color blend for each letter. keeping the highlight in the center. There's really no rhyme or reason for it. I just figured that that was the easiest way. Once all my letters were colored in, I took the colorless blender just to clean up some of those areas where some of those markers bled outside the lines. And then I cut my panel to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I adhered that down to an A2 size card base using my ATG gun. This seems to be the best adhesive for me when I'm using watercolor paper, especially when you've used a ton of water and it's warped a little bit. It seems to be the best adhesive for this. I added some sparkle with some Spectrum Noir sparkle pen, and that was it. Thanks so much for stopping by.